In the turbulent flow of time, there are names etched onto stone steles in pure gold. But there are also names that are merely whispered in the wind and sand, buried by prejudice and oblivion. History is often written by the victors, and tragically, those victors rarely tolerate different colors of skin. We often hear of Western empires, full of the Atlantic chains, but in a mysterious East, where the towers of Delhi reach up to pierce the Indian sky, there once existed a story that shook the very heavens and earth. It is the story of a man from the Black Continent. He possessed no throne, no royal bloodline, and at birth, destiny stamped upon his forehead the word slave. Yet, that very slave, with a courageous heart and ironclad loyalty, became the sole pillar for the most powerful woman in the history of Islamic India. He was Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut. She was Razia Sultan. One was the first and only Empress of Delhi. The other was an African slave despised by the entire court. The bond between them was not merely that of mistress and servant, but a forbidden affection that ignited a fire consuming an entire dynasty, exposing the nobility's deepest fears regarding race and power. Today, we will not merely tell a love story. We will embark together on a journey to reclaim justice for a soul distorted by history. Listen to the sound of hooves on the desert, the clash of swords, and the beating of two hearts that dared to defy the world. If you believe that every historical story deserves to be heard, and that the legacy of people of color needs to be honored, please take a second to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support is the torch that illuminates these hidden corners of history. The journey begins now. Part 1. The roots of the Win and every entity in this world has its roots. Just as rivers begin from underground springs winding through the hearts of mountains. To understand the man who shook the throne of Delhi, we must turn back time, returning to the land of scorching sun and dusty winds, where the African continent proudly stretches beside the Indian Ocean. Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, a name that would later resonate in chronicles as a great general, actually began his life as a nameless grain of sand in the vast desert of fate. He was born in the land the ancient Arabs called Habshi, or Abyssinia, now the territory of modern Ethiopia. It is a place where the majestic Simeon Mountains touch the clouds, where men are born with the solidity of rock and the freedom of eagles. In the scattered records that remain, no one knows who his parents were, or what his true name was when he first cried out to the world. The history of the enslaved often begins with erasure. They are stripped of their names, stripped of their pasts, and cast into a new, bitter identity. But there is one thing that no chains can strip away: the spirit of a warrior flowing in the blood. In the 13th century, the world was in a state of violent upheaval. Bustling trade routes carried not only spices and silk, but also human lives. Habshi men like Yaqut were renowned throughout the Islamic world not only for their extraordinary physical strength, but also for their absolute loyalty and rare sharp intellect. It was because of these qualities that they became valuable commodities, hunted, kidnapped, and sold across routes from Cairo to Baghdad, and further still, to the Indian subcontinent. Imagine the boy Yaqut in those years. Perhaps he once ran freely across the green savannas before the shadow of the human traffickers descended. The feeling of being torn from his parents' arms, herded onto cramped, foul-smelling wooden boats, drifting for months on the vast ocean, is a horror that human language can hardly express. The sea, for those children, was not romance. It was a deep blue grave swallowing the weakest. Yaqut survived that hellish journey. He survived not only due to his robust physique, but perhaps destiny preserved him for a greater, more tragic purpose on the other side of the ocean. Upon setting foot in India, Yaqut was no longer a free child. He was an asset. But 13th century India, under the rule of the slave dynasty, was a strange place. Here, the line between slave and king was sometimes as thin as a thread. The great Sultan Iltutmish himself, who ruled Delhi at the time, also rose from slavery. This created an interesting paradox. Although considered a lower class, truly talented slaves still had the opportunity to rise, to touch power. However, that ascent always came with a heavy price. And for a black man like Yaqut, that price was 1,000 times higher due to the deep-seated racial prejudice of the white, Turkish nobility who held court. Yaqut grew up tempered by discipline and the lash, but simultaneously absorbed the essence of the flourishing Islamic culture. He learned to care for horses, learned to wield the sword, and most importantly, he learned to observe. The eyes of a slave often see things masters overlook. He saw the rot hidden behind magnificent robes. He saw the conspiracies behind social smiles. And in those silent days, the qualities of a true Habshi gradually took shape in Yaqut. Stoic, steadfast, and loyal to the death, he was like a rough black coal, but inside held the heat of a fire, waiting to burst forth. No one expected that the African young man with the towering stature and skin as dark as the night would one day not only stand as an equal to the arrogant Turkish generals, but also become the holder of the most powerful empress's heart. But before reaching those heights and depths, Yaqut had to learn to survive in a gilded cage filled with sharp knives called the capital of Delhi. His presence at court was not merely an addition of manpower. It was the sowing of seeds for a persistent cultural and racial conflict. But Turks considered themselves a superior race, the legitimate heirs of Islamic power. In their eyes, Habshis like Yaqut were only fit to be servants, to do heavy manual labor. For a black man to dare raise his head and look them in the eye was an intolerable insult. It was in that stifling context that fate arranged a destined meeting. On one side was Yaqut, the rootless slave, carrying the pain of a stolen homeland. On the other was Razia, the talented princess bound by the chains of gender in a patriarchal society. Two people, two fates seemingly parallel, found each other at a single common point: the solitude within a crowd and the desire to affirm oneself. Their story began not with vows of mountains and seas, but with a wordless understanding between those on the margins of power. And from this humble and bitter beginning, the wheel of history began to turn, sweeping them into a storm that neither could have foreseen. Part 2. Crossing the Indian Ocean. If the desert was the cradle that birthed him, then the ocean was the crucible that forged him. For the young boy who would become Yaqut, the transition from the solid earth of East Africa to the shifting, treacherous expanse of the Indian Ocean marked the definitive severance from his past. To leave one's homeland is a tragedy. To be torn from it, bound in ropes and cast into the belly of a wooden beast, is a spiritual death. The Indian Ocean trade route, often romanticized in history books as a golden highway of spices, silk, and porcelain, possessed a darker, submerged narrative. It was a black silk road where the currency was human flesh, and the tolls were paid in blood and tears. The journey began not with the wind in the sails, but with the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold. These vessels, the dhows with their distinctive triangular sails that cut through the monsoon winds, were marvels of engineering, designed to conquer the high seas. But for the human cargo packed tightly below deck, they were floating coffins. The air was thick, stagnant, and heavy with the scent of fear, unwashed bodies and despair. Time lost its meaning in that darkness. There was no sunrise or sunset, only the rhythmic creaking of the timber and the relentless rolling of the waves that seemed to mock their misery. In this claustrophobic abyss, the boy learned his first harsh lesson of this new life. Survival is a solitary act. He saw men, stronger and older than him, succumb to illness or madness. He saw the light fade from the eyes of those who gave up hope, their bodies unceremoniously tossed overboard to become food for the sharks that trailed the slave ships like silent executioners. To survive, Yaqut had to harden his heart. He had to learn to sleep amidst the wailing of others, to fight for a meager ration of stale water, and to preserve his strength when every instinct screamed to surrender. It was here, in the damp gloom of the hold, that the innocence of childhood evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating instinct of a survivor. Yet there were moments when they were brought up to the deck, blinded by the brilliance of the equatorial sun. It was in these brief interludes that the cruel irony of their situation became most apparent. They were surrounded by a world of breathtaking beauty, the azure waters stretching endlessly to the horizon, the sky painted in hues of violet and gold. Yet they were in chains. They were traveling alongside crates of ivory, sacks of cloves, and chests of gold dust. To the merchants, there was no difference between the boy and a tusk of ivory. Both were merely commodities, investments to be protected until they could be liquidated for profit. This dehumanization was a psychological weapon, designed to break the spirit long before the body was put to work. But the ocean also taught him about the vastness of the world. As the dhows rode the monsoon winds, moving northeast toward the shores of the Indian subcontinent, Yaqut saw that the world was far larger than the village he had been stolen from. He heard the sailors speaking a polyglot of tongues: Arabic, Persian, Gujarati, Swahili. He witnessed the machinery of a global economy that connected distant lands, a machine in which he was but a cog. This realization did not bring comfort, but it brought perspective. He was small, insignificant in the face of these colossal forces, and to rise above them would require something more than just brute strength. It would require an understanding of how this new world functioned. After weeks, perhaps months, of navigating the capricious temperament of the sea, the smell of the air changed. The sharp, clean scent of salt gave way to the complex, earthy aroma of land, a mix of wood smoke, spices, and dust. India, the word itself, held a weight, a mystery. As the coastline emerged from the mist, it looked like a sleeping giant. The port where they docked, likely in the bustling regions of Gujarat or Sindh, was an assault on the senses. The noise was deafening. The shouting of porters, the haggling of merchants, the braying of donkeys, and the clanging of temple bells. It was a chaotic symphony of life that stood in stark contrast to the silence of the ocean. Disembarking from the ship, Yaqut's legs, accustomed to the swaying of the deck, struggled to find purchase on the solid ground. But there was no time to adjust. The merchants wasted no time in preparing their goods for the market. The slaves were washed, their skin oiled to glisten under the sun, and fed to appear healthy. This was the final indignity of the journey, the preparation for the sale. They were lined up in the public squares, inspected like livestock. Fingers prodded their muscles, checked their teeth, and examined their eyes. Buyers discussed their potential uses, some for the fields, some for the galleys, and the lucky few for domestic service or the military. It was in this marketplace that the stratification of the Habshi began. The physically imposing, those with the look of Mars in their eyes, were often selected for military service. The Islamic rulers of India, particularly the Turkish sultans, had a unique appreciation for African soldiers. They were seen as distinct from the local population, having no tribal loyalties or political connections in India, which made them, in theory, perfectly loyal to their masters. Yaqut, with his height and the quiet intensity he had cultivated during the voyage, caught the eye of a buyer connected to the capital. He was not bought to be a field hand. He was bought to serve the machinery of war and court. The journey from the coast to the interior was a march into the heart of a new civilization. As they traveled north towards Delhi, the landscape shifted from the humid coast to the arid, rugged terrain of the interior. The heat was different, here dry, scorching, relentless. Along the way, Yaqut observed the people of this land. He saw the caste system in operation, the rigid social hierarchies that defined every interaction. He realized that in India, everyone was a prisoner of their birth, not just the slaves. The peasant was bound to the land, the warrior to the sword, the priest to the temple. In a strange way, his status as a foreigner and a slave placed him outside this traditional Hindu caste structure, giving him a unique, albeit low, mobility within the Muslim ruling class. This journey across the ocean was more than a geographical relocation. It was a metaphysical crossing. The boy who had boarded the ship in Africa had died at sea. The man who arrived in Delhi was a blank slate, a vessel emptied of his past identity, ready to be filled with the ambition and intrigue of the Sultanate. He carried with him nothing but the scars on his wrists and the memories of the waves. But, deep within, the spirit of the Habshi remained unbroken, observant, and waiting. He had survived the Middle Passage, the hunger and the humiliation. Now, he stood at the gates of Delhi, the city of 7 empires, unaware that he was not just walking into a city, but into the pages of a history that would one day bleed his name. The ocean was behind him, but a sea of politics and blood lay ahead. Part 3. Children of the SHAWS in the grand tapestry of human history. There are threads that shimmer with the brilliance of gold, and there are threads dyed in the deepest indigo, woven into the background, providing the strength that holds the entire fabric together yet rarely acknowledged for their beauty. The story of the Habshi, or the city people in India, is exactly such a thread-strong, resilient, and ubiquitous, yet perpetually cast into the shade by the dazzling light of royal chronicles. As Yaqut stepped into the heart of the Delhi Sultanate, he was not merely entering a city, he was stepping into a peculiar brotherhood of exiles, a lineage of men who were the children of the shadows. To understand the world Yaqut was about to navigate, one must first discard the simplistic lens through which later centuries would view slavery. The shackles here were not always made of rusted iron. Often, they were forged from silver and duty. The Habshis in India occupied a paradox that was as confusing as it was dangerous. They were slaves, yes, bought and sold like cattle, yet they were also kings in all but name. They were the admirals who commanded the fleets dominating the Arabian Sea. They were the generals whose roar could silence a battlefield. And they were the trusted confidants who held the keys to the royal treasury. In a land defined by rigid caste systems and bloodlines, the African stood up an alien entity, belonging to nowhere and no one, save for the master who owned the deed to his life. This very isolation was their greatest weapon. The sultans of Delhi, sitting on their precarious thrones, lived in constant fear of their own kin. A brother could be a usurper, a son could be an assassin, a father-in-law could be a conspirator in such a nest of vipers. A slave with no family, no land, and no political ambition of his own was the only creature a king could trust. The Habshis became the living shields of the monarchy. Their loyalty was not born of love, but of necessity, a concept the Persians called namak halal, being true to the salt of one's master. Yaqut saw this reality etched into the faces of the older city warriors he encountered in the barracks. These were men who walked with the gait of lions, their skin gleaming like polished obsidian against the white marble of the palaces, their bodies scarred by battles fought for a land that would never truly call them sons. Yaqut was absorbed into this elite fraternity of the displaced. He learned that to be a Habshi in the court of Iltutmish was to live constantly in the crosshairs of envy. The ruling class of the Sultanate was dominated by the Turkic nobility, the Chahalgani or the 40. These were men of pale skin and Central Asian heritage who viewed power as their birthright. To them, the rise of the black slaves was an abomination, a stain on the purity of their aristocratic order. They looked at men like Yaqut not as fellow soldiers of Islam, but as upstart savages who had been dressed in silk but remained beasts beneath. The racial tension in Delhi was palpable, a silent war fought with sneers, whispered insults, and political maneuvering long before swords were ever drawn. Yet, it was within this hostile environment that Yaqut's spirit began to harden like tempered steel. He realized that survival here required more than just brute strength. It required an impenetrable dignity. He watched the other Africans. He saw how they communicated with barely a nod, a silent language of solidarity forged in the fires of shared trauma. They were the children of the shadows because they operated in the dark corners of the court. Seeing everything, hearing everything, yet remaining invisible until summoned. They were the keepers of secrets, the silent observers who knew which minister was embezzling funds and which general was plotting a coup. This invisibility was a form of power, and Yaqut, with his sharp intellect, began to master the art of being present yet unnoticed. But the shadow is not just a place of hiding, it is also a place of cooling respite from the scorching sun. For Yaqut, the camaraderie among the Habshis was the only family he had left. In the evenings, when the call to prayer had faded and the oil lamps flickered in the barracks, they would gather men from Ethiopia, from Zanzibar, from Nubia. They would speak in broken dialects of their mother tongues, sharing memories of a home that was fading like a dream at dawn. They spoke of the great baobab trees, of the smell of rain on the savannah, of mothers whose faces they could no longer recall. These moments of vulnerability were fleeting, quickly masked by the stoic mask of the soldier, but they were the fuel that kept their souls alive. They reminded Yaqut that he was not just a tool of the Sultan, he was a human being with a history, a heritage, and a worth that no amount of gold could measure. As he rose through the ranks, transitioning from a mere stable hand to a skilled horseman, Yaqut began to understand the precarious nature of his existence. He was climbing a ladder where every rung was slippery with blood. The higher he went, the more he became a target for the Turkic nobles who watched his ascent with venomous jealousy. They saw his competence as arrogance. They saw his loyalty as sick. But Yaqut did not care for their approval. He was driven by a hunger that was spiritual as much as it was physical, the hunger to carve out a space where he could stand tall, not as a shadow, but as a man. The wind of destiny was beginning to howl through the corridors of Delhi. The great Sultan Iltutmish was aging, and the question of succession hung over the capital like a storm cloud. In this volatile atmosphere, the children of the shadows would soon be called upon to step into the light, and for Yaqut, the defining moment was approaching, not on a battlefield, but in the royal stables, where a chance encounter with a princess who possessed the spirit of a king would change the trajectory of his life forever. The shadow was about to meet the sun, and the eclipse that followed would be written in blood. Part 4. The capital of Delhi. The ocean was a test of the body's endurance. The capital city of Delhi was a trial of the soul's fortitude, rising from the dusty plains of North India like a mirage carved from red sandstone and white marble. Delhi in the 13th century was not merely a city, it was a physical manifestation of absolute power. For a man like Yaqut, who had known the freedom of the African highlands and the confinement of the slave ship, Delhi presented a new kind of cage, one that was gilded, magnificent, and terrifyingly vast. To walk through its gates was to step into the belly of a beast that breathed ambition and exhaled conspiracy. The city under Sultan Iltutmish was a cosmopolitan wonder, a jewel in the crown of the Islamic East that rivaled Baghdad and Cairo. It was a sanctuary for scholars, poets, and mystics fleeing the Mongol hordes that were ravaging Central Asia. But for the enslaved, the architecture of Delhi served a singular purpose: intimidation. The towering minarets, including the rising Qutb Minar which pierced the sky like the finger of God, were designed to make a man feel small, to remind him that he was but a speck of dust in the shadow of the divine and the royal. Yaqut walked these streets, his senses assaulted by the cacophony of 1,000 tongues: Persian, Turkish, Arabic, and Hindiviol merging into a roar of commerce and command. He was brought to the royal complex, a labyrinth of courtyards and colonnades where the air was perpetually heavy with the scent of jasmine and the metallic temps of polished armor. Here, the hierarchy of existence was brutally clear. At the top sat the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth. Below him were the Chahalgani, the Chorus of 40, a powerful clique of Turkic slave officers who held the true reins of the empire. They were men of fair skin and sharp hawk-like features, hailing from the steppes of Central Asia. They walked the corridors of power with the arrogance of those who believe they are the natural masters of the world. In their eyes, the empire belonged to the Turks. Everyone else was merely a guest or a servant. Yaqut felt the weight of their gaze long before he understood their politics. To the Chahalgani, the presence of Habshis in the court was a necessary evil, a source of labor and muscle, but never of intellect or equality. They looked at Yaqut's dark skin and towering frame with a mixture of utility and disdain. To them, he was a beast of burden, strong enough to crush a skull, but, in their prejudiced estimation, incapable of understanding the nuances of governance or courtly love. This racial divide was an invisible wall, thicker and harder to breach than the stone ramparts of the Red Fort. It was a silent humiliation that hung in the air, unspoken but understood by every glance and every sneer directed his way. Yet, it was precisely this underestimation that granted Yaqut a unique vantage point. He was assigned to the royal stables, the Amaraka department. In the medieval world, the stables were not just a place for animals. They were a critical nerve center of military power. The cavalry was the backbone of the Sultan's army, and those who controlled the horses controlled the flow of battle. While the nobles spent their days drinking wine and plotting in hushed whispers behind silk curtains, Yaqut spent his days and nights with the beasts. He found a strange solace in the company of the royal steeds. These magnificent Arabian and Turkoman horses did not care about the color of his skin or his lineage. They respected only the steadiness of his hand and the calmness of his spirit in the solitude of the stables. Amidst the smell of hay and leather, Yaqut began to carve out his own domain. He learned that horses, like empires, could not be ruled by fear alone. They required a connection, a rhythm, a dialogue without words. His talent was undeniable. The wildest stallions, which would throw off the arrogant Turkic officers, would bow their heads to the gentle touch of the African slave. This mastery over the most noble of beasts was the first crack in the glass ceiling that trapped him. It was a silent declaration that nobility was not a matter of blood, but of character. However, Delhi was a city that never slept, and its walls had ears. Even in the stables, Yaqut could feel the tremors of the impending political earthquake. Sultan Iltutmish was a visionary, but he was surrounded by wolves. The 40 were already sharpening their knives, waiting for the old lion to weaken so they could tear the kingdom apart for themselves. They saw the throne not as a responsibility, but as a prize. Yaqut, from his humble position, observed the parade of sycophants and traitors passing through the palace gates. He saw the hollowness of their pomp, the fragility of their alliances. He realized that in this city of stone, the only thing that truly mattered was loyalty, a commodity so rare that it was more precious than the diamonds of Golconda. As the sun set over the Yamuna River, painting the white domes of the capital in hues of blood orange and violet, Yaqut would often stand looking towards the royal quarters. He was an outsider, a man with no past and a precarious future, but deep within him, the warrior spirit of his ancestors was awakening. He did not know yet that his destiny was linked to the inhabitants of those high towers. He did not know that the very racial hatred he faced would become the crucible in which a legendary love would be forged. Delhi thought it had broken him, categorized him, and dismissed him. But the city was wrong. It had merely given the Black Pearl a setting in which to shine. And soon, the glare would be blinding enough to expose the darkest secrets of the empire. Part 5. The eyes of the Prince's destiny often moves with the quiet tread of a leopard, unseen and unheard until the moment it leaps. In the sprawling complex of the Delhi Sultanate, amidst the intrigue of ministers and the clamor of armies, a silence was about to be broken. It was not a silence of sound, but a silence of the soul. For years, Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut had existed in the periphery of the royal vision, a shadow moving among the beasts, efficient, invisible, and essential. But the universe has a way of correcting its own imbalances, and it does so by bringing together those who are most unlikely to meet, yet most destined to understand one another. It began on a morning when the sun hung low and heavy over the Yamuna, casting long, golden spears of light through the dust of the royal training grounds. The air was crisp, smelling of trampled earth and dry grass. Yaqut was in the paddock, his hands busy with the reins of a temperamental Turkoman stallion that had thrown 2 seasoned officers the day before. The beast was a storm of muscle and fury, its eyes rolling wild with the instinct to dominate. But Yaqut did not fight the animal. He spoke to it. A low, rhythmic hum resonated from his chest, a vibration of calm that seemed to seep into the horse's nervous system. He stood close, dangerously close, his dark hand resting firmly on the quivering neck, transmitting a message of peace and absolute authority that was in this moment of intense concentration that the world shifted. The heavy wooden gates of the training ground creaked open, not for a squadron of soldiers, but for a small, singular procession. At the center rode a figure that defied the rigid conventions of the age. It was Razia. She was not yet the Sultan, but even then, she wore her royalty not like a jeweled ornament, but like armor. Unlike the other women of the harem, who were sequestered behind veils and lattice screens, living lives of perfumed suffocation, Razia rode with her face uncovered, her chin held high, her eyes scanning the horizon with the hunger of a conqueror. She had come to inspect the cavalry, a duty typically reserved for princes, but her father, Iltware, had raised her to be more than a princess. He had raised her to be a king in spirit. The courtiers whispered that she had the heart of a man, but they were wrong. She had the heart of a ruler, which knows no gender. As she trotted into the paddock, the chatter of the grooms and the clatter of equipment died down. All heads bowed in reverence and fear. All, except one. Yaqut, caught in the trance of his work, did not immediately bow. He was locked in a silent battle of wills with the stallion. As Razia pulled her horse to a halt, she watched him. She saw the sweat glistening on his ebony skin, the tension in his forearms, and the utter lack of fear in his posture. For the first time, she was looking at a man who was not trying to impress her, not trying to curry favor or weave a web of deceit. She was looking at competence in its purest form. In a court filled with peacocks strutting in borrowed feathers, here was a hawk. The stallion reared suddenly, hooves flashing in the air, a lethal dance of defiance. The guards stepped forward, hands reaching for their swords to strike the beast down, but Razia raised a hand to stop them. She watched as Yaqut held his ground. He did not flinch. With a sudden, fluid motion, he pulled the animal down, not with violence, but with a precise shift of weight and a sharp command that cracked like a whip in the silent air. The horse shuddered, exhaled a long breath, and stood still, defeated not by pain but by presence. Only then did Yaqut turn. He realized the silence of the yard was unnatural. He looked up and his gaze collided with hers. It is said that the eyes are the windows to the soul, but in that moment they were mirrors. Razia looked into the eyes of the Abyssinian slave and saw a reflection of her own solitude. She saw a strength that had been forged in the fires of adversity, a dignity that no chains could bind. And Yaqut, looking up at the daughter of the Sultan, saw not a master, but a kindred spirit trapped in a different kind of cage. He saw the loneliness of power, the burden of expectation, and the fierce intelligence that was suffocating under the weight of tradition. Time seemed to warp, stretching that single exchange of glances into an eternity. It was a violation of every social code. A slave looking directly at a princess, a black man meeting the gaze of a Turkic noblewoman. By the laws of the time, he could have been blinded for such insolence. But Razia did not look away. She did not see a Habshi. She saw a man who understood the language of control, the delicate balance between holding on and letting go. She saw someone who, like her, was an outsider, him by race and status, her by gender and intellect. "You have a gentle hand for such a wild spirit," Razia said, her voice cutting through the stillness. It was not a command, nor a compliment. It was an observation, leveled between equals. Yaqut bowed then, low and respectful, but the connection had already been made. "The spirit is not wild, Highness," he replied, his voice deep and steady, accented with the rhythms of a distant land. "It is merely misunderstood. It fights because it fears losing its freedom. Once it knows it is safe, it will serve." The words hung in the air, heavy with double meaning. Razia felt a shiver run down her spine. It fights because it fears losing its freedom. Was he speaking of the horse, or was he speaking of her? Was he speaking of himself? In those few sentences, Yaqut had dismantled the barrier between them. He had spoken a truth that the sycophantic poets of the court would never dare to utter. She rode closer, leaning down from her saddle, invading his personal space, challenging the invisible walls of caste and propriety. "And who taught you the language of freedom, soldier?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for the slightest hint of fear. "Life, Highness," Yaqut answered, not retreating. "And the ocean. They teach us that we are small, but they also teach us that we can endure." Razia straightened up, a rare faint smile touching her lips. It was a smile of recognition. She had found something she didn't know she was looking for, an anchor. In a world of shifting sands and treacherous alliances, she had found a rock. She turned her horse, signaling her departure, but the energy in the paddock had changed irrevocably. The grooms exhaled, the guards relaxed, but Yaqut remained standing, watching her retreat. He did not know it yet, but the chains of his slavery had just begun to dissolve, only to be replaced by bonds of a much more dangerous kind. He had caught the eye of the future sultan. He had seen the woman beneath the crown, and in that brief electric silence, the seeds of a devotion that would defy empires and death itself were sown. The princess had looked at the slave, and for the first time in the history of Delhi, the slave had looked back, and neither had blinked. Part 6. The silent Tiacha trust is not a structure built in a day. It is a slow accumulation of sediment, layer upon layer, until it becomes solid rock capable of withstanding the fiercest tides. Following that fateful morning in the paddock, the dynamic between the princess and the slave underwent a subtle but irreversible transformation. The court of Delhi continued its loud, performative existence. Ministers debated, poets recited empty verses, and generals boasted of conquests. But in the quiet, gray hours before dawn, a different kind of education was taking place. Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut had become Razia's shadow, and more importantly, her silent teacher. It was an arrangement born of necessity but fueled by a mutual recognition of spirit. Razia knew that to rule a kingdom of wolves, she could not simply be a sheep in royal clothing. She had to be a lioness. The Turkish officers, bound by their rigid codes of chivalry and gender bias, treated her with a patronizing delicacy. They taught her to ride for parades, not for war. They taught her to hold a dagger like a piece of jewelry, not a tool of survival. Yaqut, however, possessed no such illusions. He knew the world was a brutal place where the only difference between a king and a corpse was the speed of one's reflex. In the misty seclusion of the private training grounds, away from the prying eyes of the harem eunuchs and the gossiping nobility, Yaqut stripped away the pageantry of her station. He did not treat her as a woman, nor as a princess. He treated her as a student of the art of survival. He introduced her to the Abyssinian way of war, a style less reliant on the heavy, crushing brute force favored by the Turks, and more focused on agility, endurance, and the lethal precision of a striking cobra. There were mornings when the only sounds were the heavy breathing of the horses and the rhythmic thud-thud of wooden practice swords clashing. Yaqut, towering and imposing, would not hold back. He would strike, feint, and disarm her, sending her weapon clattering into the dust time and again. A lesser man would have feared punishment for such insolence. A lesser royal would have felt humiliated. But between them, there was an unspoken agreement. The training ground was a sanctuary of truth. Here, titles meant nothing. If she left her flank open, she would die. If she hesitated, she would fall. Yaqut was teaching her the most valuable lesson a ruler could learn: the consequences of error. "Your anger makes you slow, Highness," he would say, his voice a low rumble, devoid of malice. He would step back, waiting for her to pick up her blade. "The sword is not a hammer to vent your frustration. It is a brush. You are painting your will upon the air. Calm the water. and you will see the reflection of your enemy's intent. He taught her to listen to the horse not with her ears, but with her legs and her balance. He showed her how a slight shift in weight could turn a galloping stallion faster than any tug on the bit. He taught her the Habshi crouch, a way of riding low and tight to the animal's neck, making oneself a smaller target for archers while maximizing speed. These were not the lessons of a servant. They were the secrets of a warrior caste, passed down through generations of men who had to fight for every inch of ground they stood on. Through this grueling physical discipline, an intimacy began to bloom not of the flesh, but of the mind. They communicated in a shorthand of nods and glances. Yaqut learned to read the subtle tightening of her jaw that signaled defiance. Razia learned to interpret the stillness in his eyes that warned of danger. He became the only person in her life who did not want something from her. The nobles wanted favors. The family wanted compliance. The people wanted miracles. Yaqut wanted only for her to be strong. His loyalty was pure, unadulterated by political ambition. This relationship, however, did not go unnoticed. The silent teacher was becoming a visible problem. The sight of the black slave riding flank to flank with the princess, correcting her posture, sometimes even placing a guiding hand on her arm to adjust her grip, sent ripples of unease through the conservative corridors of the palace. To the Turkish nobility, this was a subversion of the natural order. A slave was meant to kneel, not to instruct. They saw Yaqut's rising influence not as a testament to his skill, but as a sorcery, a dark influence creeping into the pristine lineage of the Sultanate. But Razia ignored the whispers. In Yaqut, she had found the one thing the vast treasury of Delhi could not buy, a mirror that showed her potential, not her limitations. He was carving the statue of a queen out of the raw marble of a princess. As the sun rose higher each day, burning off the morning mist, it revealed a Razia who walked with a new dangerous grace of steeliness in her spine that had been tempered by the black pearl. She was no longer just Iltutmish's daughter. She was becoming a warrior who could look at a battlefield and see not fear, but opportunity. And standing always a few paces behind her, silent and watchful, was the architect of this transformation, ready to catch her if she fell, but determined to ensure she never would. Part 7. The Death of the King. The death of a great king is never merely a biological cessation. It is a seismic event, a tectonic shift that cracks the very foundations of the earth upon which the empire stands. In the year 1236, a heavy silence descended upon the Red Palace of Delhi, a silence more deafening than the roar of any battlefield. Sultan el-Tutmish, the titan who had carved a dynasty out of chaos, the man who had been the sun around which the entire galaxy of the Sultanate revolved, was fading. The air in the royal chambers grew thick with the scent of camphor and rosewater, masking the sterile odor of decay. But nothing could mask the scent of fear and opportunity that wafted through the corridors. For Yaqut, standing guard at the periphery of the royal apartments, the impending death of the Sultan felt like the slow crumbling of a dam. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had watched the wild predators of Africa, that the moment the old lion closed his eyes, the hyenas would tear the pride apart. El-Tutmish had been the guarantor of order. His iron will had held the fractious Turkic nobility in check. He was the one who had allowed a slave like Yaqut to rise, and a daughter like Razia to dream. Without him, the laws of gravity in Delhi would cease to exist. Inside the dimly lit chamber, a drama of unprecedented audacity was unfolding. The Sultan, his body ravaged by illness but his mind still sharp as a diamond, had made a decision that would echo through eternity. He looked at his sons Ruknuddin Firuz and the others and saw only weakness. He saw men who preferred the intoxicating haze of wine and the soft embrace of courtesans to the cold, hard steel of governance. Then, he looked at Razia. He saw the fire he had bequeathed her, the discipline she had honed with her Abyssinian mentor, and the intellect that outshone the brightest scholars of his court. With his dying breath, Iltutmish did the unthinkable. He dictated a decree nominating his daughter Razia as his successor. "My sons are devoted to the pleasures of youth," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But my daughter, she is a better man than all of them combined." The proclamation hit the court like a physical blow. The scribes trembled as they wrote it down. The Chalholgan of the corps of 40 stood in the shadows of the room, their faces masks of stone, but their eyes burning with indignation. To these proud Turkic warriors, the idea of bowing before a woman was an insult to their manhood and their religion. They nodded respectfully to the dying king, murmuring words of obedience. But in their hearts, treason had already taken root. They were not mourning the loss of a leader. They were calculating the division of his spoils. Yaqut watched them leave the royal chambers, their silk robes swishing softly against the marble floor. He saw the furtive glances exchanged between the ministers, the slight curls of lips that signaled disdain. He knew these men. He knew that their loyalty was as ephemeral as the morning mist. To them, Iltutmish's will was merely a suggestion, one they intended to bury along with his corpse. When the final moment came, and the great heart of the Sultan stopped beating, a wail went up from the harem that pierced the night sky of Delhi. The city plunged into mourning. Flags were lowered, and the bazaars fell silent. But amidst the public display of grief, the knives were being sharpened. The protection that had shielded Razia was gone. She was now standing alone on a precipice, with the abyss of history waiting to swallow her whole. Yaqut found her in the stables that night, away from the suffocating rituals of the funeral. She was standing by her horse, her forehead resting against the animal's warm neck, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was not crying for the crown she might lose. She was crying for the father who had believed in her when no one else did. Yaqut did not approach her. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply stood at the entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his body blocking the doorway. It was a silent vow. The king was dead. The laws were broken. The era of peace was over. From this night forward, he would no longer just be her teacher or her servant. He would be her wall. The 40 would come for her. He knew this with absolute certainty. They would try to crush her spirit, steal her birthright, and erase her name. But to get to her, they would first have to cross the line drawn by the Abyssinian slave. The sun that set on El-Tutmish's reign took with it the light of certainty. As the darkness of the uncertain future enveloped the capital, Yaqut looked out at the flickering torches of the palace and realized that the training was over. The game of shadows had ended, and the war for the soul of India had begun. Part 8. The Coup of Razia. The ink on Sultan Iltutmish's final decree was barely dry before it was spat upon by the very men who had sworn to protect it. History is full of betrayals, but few were as swift and shameless as the one enacted by the 40 in the days following the great king's death, driven by their disdain for a female ruler and their hunger for a puppet they could control. The Turkic nobility bypassed Razia and placed her half-brother Rukn-ud-Din Firuz on the peacock throne. It was a coronation of vice. Rukn-ud-Din was a creature of the harem, a man who drowned the sorrows of the state in wine and left the governance to his cruel mother, Shah. Under their rule, Delhi descended into a nightmare of chaos, where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder, and the cries of the poor were drowned out by the music of palace orgies. For Razia, this was not just a theft of her birthright, it was the defilement of her father's legacy. Confined within the palace walls, watched by guards who were once her protectors, she sat in the eye of the storm. But she was not idle. In the shadows, away from the drunken revelry of the new sultan, she and Yaqut were plotting a move that no strategist in India had ever conceived. They knew they could not win a war of swords against the combined might of the provincial governors. The army belonged to the 40, but the city, the teeming, sweating, suffering mass of humanity outside the palace gates belonged to no one. And that is where the true power lay. Yaqut became the conduit between the isolated princess and the pulse of the city. Moving like a phantom through the back alleys of Delhi, he gathered intelligence. He heard the grumbling of the merchants, the anger of the imams, and the despair of the soldiers who had served Iltutmish and now watched his empire rot. He brought these whispers back to Razia, feeding the fire of her resolve. They realized that to take the throne, Razia had to stop being a princess of the court and become a daughter of the people. She had to do what no royal woman had ever done. She had to step out from behind the veil and demand justice from the mob. The day chosen was a Friday, the holy day of Jummah, when the great congregation gathered at the central mosque. It was a gamble of life and death. If the people rejected her, she would be stoned or imprisoned. If the guards intercepted her, she would be executed for treason. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows over the courtyard of the Quartal Islam Mosque, a figure appeared on the balcony of the royal palace overlooking the gathering. It was Razia, but she was not dressed in the royal silks of a princess. She was clad in red, the color of the aggrieved, the color of those demanding justice in the Islamic tradition. She stood there, a solitary flame against the gray stone, vulnerable yet terrifyingly bold. Yaqut was there, positioned invisibly within the crowd below, his hand gripping a dagger beneath his cloak. He was the failsafe. If an arrow flew, if a guard rushed her, he would be the first to spill blood. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear for himself, but with a profound awe for the woman standing above. He watched as she raised her voice, not with the shrillness of desperation, but with the clarion ring of command. "People of Delhi," she cried out, her voice carrying over the thousands of bowed heads. "My father, your sultan, gave this throne to me not because I am his flesh, but because he knew I would protect yours. Look at what has become of his legacy. The usurper drinks while your children starve. The Queen Mother murders the innocent while the laws of God are trampled." The crowd, stunned, looked up. They saw a woman, yes, but they heard the spirit of Iltutmish. She threw off the veil, exposing her face to the multitude, a shocking act of defiance that signaled she had nothing to hide. "If I fail you," she vowed, "then strike my head from my shoulders, but give me the chance to serve you." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a soul. Then, a low rumble began. It started from the back, from the beggars, and the laborers, unswelled like a tidal wave. "Razia, Razia, Sultan Razia." The chant grew until it shook the very foundations of the mosque. The mob, ignited by her courage and the stark red of her garments, turned into an unstoppable force. They surged toward the palace gates, overwhelming the guards who were too stunned to react. The 40 nobles, comfortable in their arrogance, were caught completely off guard. They had prepared for a military coup. They had not prepared for a revolution. Yaqut moved with the tide, guiding the energy, protecting the flanks, ensuring the chaos remained focused on the usurper and not his mistress. By sunset, the palace had been stormed. Rukn-ud-Din Firuz was dragged from his pleasure chambers, and Shah Turkan was imprisoned. The people had spoken that evening. As the dust settled and the call to prayer rang out once more over a liberated city, Razia sat upon the throne of Delhi. She was the first female sultan in history. She was exhausted, her red robe stained with the dust of the rebellion. The court was filled with the cheers of the populace, but her eyes sought only one person. Standing in the shadows of the great pillars, far removed from the circle of sycophants already trying to curry favor, was Yaqut. He met her gaze and offered a slow, deep bow. It was not the bow of a slave to a master, it was the salute of a soldier to his commander. They had done the impossible. They had stolen an empire from the jaws of patriarchy. But as Yaqut straightened up, he saw the looks on the faces of the Turkic nobles who had been forced to swear allegiance. He saw the hatred burning behind their forced smiles. He knew that the coup was the easy part. Keeping the crown would be a war of a different kind, and in this new war, his position as the Sultan's closest confidant would make him the most hated man in India. The Red Queen had risen, but the Black General would now have to shield her from the inevitable eclipse. Part 9. Ami Arayaka. Power is not merely the possession of a throne, it is the ability to command the space around it. Razia Sultan had ascended the steps of the Red Palace. She had worn the crown, and she had the coins struck in her name pillar of women, Queen of the Times. But she knew, with the sharp instinct of a survivor, that the title of Sultan was hollow if the hands that held the sword of state were not her own. The court she inherited was a viper's nest, populated by the 40, the Chahalgani who viewed her as a temporary anomaly, a placeholder until they could find a more pliable puppet. To survive, Razia needed to break their monopoly on power. She needed to create a new center of gravity, and she chose to do so by elevating the one man whose loyalty was not for sale. The announcement came on a day of heavy heat. When the air in the Durbar hall was thick enough to choke on, the nobles stood in their designated rows, a glittering array of silk and steel, their faces masks of bored arrogance. They expected the new female sultan to announce tax reforms or distribute arms. What they did not expect was a restructuring of the imperial hierarchy. When Razia's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, summoning Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut to the foot of the throne, a ripple of confusion passed through the assembly. For his unwavering service, his unmatched skill in the arts of war, and his absolute fidelity to the crown, Razia proclaimed, her eyes locking with the hostile gazes of her generals. I hereby appoint Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut as Amirayaka. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a collective intake of breath before a scream. Amir Akartha, lord of the royal stables. To the uninitiated, it might sound like a servant's role, a glorified groom, but in the martial society of the 13th century, where the cavalry was the hammer of the empire, the master of the stables was one of the most powerful military positions in the realm. It was a role traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking Turkic nobles, a stepping stone to the viziership. It granted the holder control over the army's mobility, access to the royal ear, and the right to walk mere steps behind the sultan at all times. To give this title to a Habshi, a non-Turk, a black man, a former slave, was not just a promotion. It was a declaration of war against the established order. It was Razia's way of saying that merit would henceforth outweigh bloodline. As Yaqut stepped forward to receive the ceremonial robe of office, the contrast was blinding. Here stood a man of obsidian skin, towering over the pale Turkic courtiers, accepting a mantle of authority that they believed belonged to them by divine right. Yaqut felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders physically. As the heavy brocade was draped over him, he could feel the daggers of envy staring at his back. He knew what this meant. He was no longer just a shadow in the stable. He was now a monolith in the court. By accepting this title, he was stepping into the line of fire. He looked up at Razia, seated high above on the throne. Her face was impassive, regal, but in her eyes he saw a silent plea. Help me hold this world together. He knelt and kissed the ground, swearing an oath that was more than ceremonial. I am the sword in your hand, my sultan, he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. I will break before I bend. The fallout was immediate and venomous. The Turkic nobles left the court in a fury, their whispers turning into hisses of sedition. They could tolerate a woman on the throne, perhaps if she played by their rules. But to see an African slave raised above them, to see a barbarian giving orders to the elite cavalry, it was a humiliation they could not stomach. In the tea houses and private chambers of Delhi, the narrative began to shift. They stopped attacking Razia's gender and began attacking her judgment, and more dangerously, they began to attack her morality. The position of Amiraka required Yaqut to personally assist the Sultan in mounting and dismounting her horse. It was a duty of intimate proximity. In the days that followed, every time Yaqut offered his arm to Razia, every time he lifted her onto the royal steed, the eyes of the court watched with obsessive, prurient scrutiny. Where there was duty, they saw desire. Where there was loyalty, they saw lust. The promotion intended to secure Razia's safety had inadvertently handed her enemies the most dangerous weapon of all. Scandal. Yaqut walked the corridors of power now, not as a ghost, but as a target. He tightened security, purged the stables of spies, and surrounded Razia with a wall of trusted Abyssinian guards. He knew the storm was gathering. The promotion had been a masterstroke of meritocracy, but in a world built on prejudice, merit is often the first casualty. The Lord of the Stables had been given the reins of the Empire's might, but he was riding a tiger, and the slightest slip would mean being devoured. Part 10. Whispers in the harem. If the sword is the weapon of the soldier, then the whisper is the weapon of the coward. In the marble corridors of the Red Palace, where the air was always cool and scented with musk, a poison was being brewed not in a cauldron, but on the tongues of the courtiers. The elevation of Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut to the rank of Amaraka had stunned the nobility into a temporary silence, but that silence had now broken into a cacophony of malicious gossip. The enemies of Razia Sultan, realizing they could not defeat her on the battlefield of governance, chose to strike at the one place where a woman was most vulnerable in a patriarchal world. Her virtue. The seed of the scandal was planted in the most public of places, the royal courtyard. Every morning, before the business of the empire began, Razia would ride out to inspect her city. It was a ritual of power, but the eyes of the 40 were no longer watching the queen. They were fixated on the man standing at the stirrup of her horse. By custom and duty, it was the task of the Amiraka to assist the sovereign in mounting their steed. For a male sultan, this was a mundane act of service, but for a female sultan and a male subordinate, it became a theater of dangerous intimacy. Yaqut would approach the great white stallion, calming the beast with a touch, and then turn to Razia. He would lock his fingers together, creating a human step for her boot. As she placed her foot in his hands and he hoisted her upwards, there was a fleeting moment of physical contact, a hand on his shoulder, his strength lifting her weight. To Yaqut and Razia, this was a dance of efficiency and trust. It was the synchronized movement of two warriors who moved as one entity. But to the leering eyes of the Turkic nobles watching from the balconies, it was an embrace. They analyzed the way he looked at her. They dissected the way she leaned on him. They took a moment of absolute loyalty and painted it with the vulgar colors of lust. Look, they whispered behind their jeweled hands. Look how the Abyssinian touches her. Look how the queen of the world lowers herself to be handled by a slave. The rumors spread from the palace to the bazaars like a contagion. The storytellers, paid by the rival nobles, began to spin tales of forbidden nights in the royal chambers. They spoke of a bewitchment, claiming that the black slave had used dark African magic to enslave the heart of the queen. They called Yaqut the night that swallowed the moon. These stories were not just idle gossip. They were a calculated political strategy designed to strip Razia of her divine authority. In the eyes of the conservative Islamic society of the 13th century, a ruler could be ruthless, but they could not be immoral. And for a noblewoman to consort with a man of a lower race was considered the ultimate degradation. Yaqut heard the whispers. He saw the way the servants fell silent when he entered a room. He felt the change in the atmosphere, heavy with judgment and titillation. The pain this caused him was not for his own reputation. He had long ago accepted that he was an outsider, but for hers. He was the mud being flung at the hem of her royal robe. One evening, in the solitude of the stables, he dared to breach the subject. He offered to resign, to vanish back into the shadows from whence he came, to save her from the growing storm. "My presence is a blight upon your name, Majesty," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Let me go. A queen cannot be dragged down by her servant." Razia looked at him, her eyes flashing with the same fire that had cowed the mob at the mosque. She refused. To her, sending him away would be an admission of guilt. It would be a surrender to the prejudices of men she despised. "If I send you away," she replied, her voice steely, "then I am no longer the Sultan. I become just another woman afraid of what men say. You stay, not because I need a servant, but because I need the truth. And in this entire city of liars, you are the only truth I have." It was a decision made of immense courage, but perhaps fatal pride. By refusing to distance herself from Yaqut, Razia inadvertently confirmed the rumors in the minds of her enemies. The Chalgani saw her defiance not as strength, but as the blindness of love. They fed these reports to the provincial governors, including Malik Altunia, the governor of Batinda and Razia's childhood friend. Altunia, who had harbored his own ambitions and, perhaps, his own affections for Razia, listened to the tales of the black lover with a growing rage. The whispers had found their target. They had turned potential allies into jealous enemies. The tragedy of the harem is that walls have ears, but they have no heart. The bond between Razia and Yaqut was likely one of the most profound spiritual connections in history, a meeting of two lonely souls who found solace in each other as strength. But the world was not ready to understand a love that transcended skin color and class. The world only saw what it wanted to see, a scandal. And as the whispers grew into a roar, they began to drown out the achievements of her reign. The roads she built, the schools she founded, the justice she dispensed were being overshadowed by the dark silhouette of the man standing at her side. The psychological siege had begun, and soon the weapons would change from words to steel. Part 11. The racial fear. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold in the dust of the Indian plains, we must first dissect the anatomy of the hate that fueled it. The whispers in the harem and the gossip in the bazaars were merely the surface symptoms of a much deeper, more malignant disease. The hostility directed toward Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut was not simply a matter of court jealousy or sexual scandal. It was the manifestation of a primal, visceral panic that had gripped the ruling elite of the Delhi Sultanate. It was a fear of the other, a racial anxiety so potent that it threatened to tear the empire apart. The Chahalgani, the 40 Turkic slave nobles who held the true reins of power, viewed themselves as a distinct and superior breed. They were the Turks of the line, tracing their heritage to the steppes of Central Asia. In their worldview, power was a color-coded commodity. Fair skin, sharp features, and Turkic blood were the prerequisites for leadership. They saw themselves as the martial guardians of Islam in India, the only ones capable of wielding the sword of command. The indigenous Indian population was to be ruled, and the African slaves the Habshis were to serve. This was the natural order, a hierarchy as rigid as the caste system they had encountered in the lands they conquered. Yaqut was a living, breathing violation of this order. He was a Habshi, a man of the dark continent. In the prejudiced eyes of the nobility, his skin color marked him as a creature of labor, not of intellect or authority. Yet, here he was, standing at the pinnacle of the military apparatus, the Amir-i-Kha, commanding the very cavalry that the Turks considered their exclusive domain. Every time Yaqut issued an order that was obeyed, every time he devised a strategy that succeeded, he drove a spike of insecurity into the hearts of the nobles. He was proof that their superiority was a myth. He demonstrated that nobility was not in the blood, but in the deed. For an aristocracy built on the fragile foundation of lineage, there is no truth more terrifying than merit. The fear went deeper than just professional rivalry. There was a psychosexual element to their hatred, a complex web of insecurity regarding masculinity and power. The Habshis were stereotyped in the medieval world for their immense physical strength and virility. The Turkish nobles, softened by the luxuries of palace life, by wine and opium, looked at the raw ascetic power of Yaqut with a mix of disdain and envy. The thought that their queen, the symbol of their state, might prefer the company of a black barbarian to the refined company of her own kin was an intolerable blow to their collective ego. It wasn't just that she might love him, it was that she respected him. That respect was a mirror reflecting their own inadequacies. Furthermore, Razia's reliance on Yaqut signaled a terrifying political shift. The Sultanate was transitioning from a tribal oligarchy, where power was shared among a brotherhood of Turks, to an absolute monarchy where the ruler stood above all factions, supported by a diverse meritocracy. By elevating an African Razia was building a counter-nobility, a new class of loyalists who owed their allegiance solely to the throne, not to any clan or ethnicity. The 40 realized that if Yaqut was allowed to survive and thrive, he would open the door for others. Soon the court might be filled with Abyssinians, Persians, and Hindu converts, diluting the Turkish hegemony until it ceased to exist. This was the racial fear. It was the fear of replacement. It was the dread of the minority ruling class realizing that their grip on power was slipping. They looked at Yaqut and didn't just see a man. They saw a floodgate. If a slave could become a general, then the entire structure of their society was a lie. They had to destroy him not just to remove a rival, but to restore the purity of the court. They had to make an example of him to prove that no matter how high a Habshi climbed, he could always be dragged back down to the dirt. The tragedy of Yaqut was that he was fighting a war he could not win with swords. He could parry a blow, he could outmaneuver an army, but he could not fight the color of his own skin. He could not fight the centuries of prejudice that had been baked into the psyche of his enemies. As he walked the ramparts of Delhi, checking the defenses, he must have felt the heavy, suffocating weight of this hatred. He knew that to them, he was a monster. But in the eyes of history, the true monsters were those who would burn their own kingdom to the ground rather than share it with a man who looked different. The stage was now set for the final act. The racial fear had curdled into a murderous resolve. The nobles knew they could not strike Razia directly while the people of Delhi loved her. They had to draw her out. They had to separate the queen from her city and the lioness from her protector. And to do that, they turned to the one man whose betrayal would hurt Razia the most, man who shared their Turkic blood, but who also shared a history with the queen. The conspiracy was no longer a whisper. It was a drawn blade, pointing north, toward the governorship of Part 12. The alliance of traitors' betrayal is rarely a sudden explosion. It is more often a slow-acting poison, administered drop by those we once invited to our table. As the heat of the Indian summer began to bake the plains of the Punjab, the 40 Turkic nobles finally found the dagger they needed to strike at the heart of Razia Sultan. They knew they could not attack her directly within the walls of Delhi, for the people of the capital adored their queen, and the royal guard, commanded by the fierce Abyssinian loyalty of Yaqut, was impenetrable. To destroy her, they needed to lure her out. They needed a bait so personal, so emotionally charged, that Razia would abandon caution and ride into the open jaws of a trap. That bait was Malik Ikhruddin Altunia was the governor of Bathinda, a formidable fortress city to the northwest. But he was more than just a vassal. He was a ghost from Razia's past. They had grown up together in the shadow of Sultan Iltutmish, sharing the same tutors, the same training grounds, and perhaps the same unspoken dreams. Altunia was the mirror image of what the Turkish nobility desired in a consort. He was of their blood, handsome, ambitious, and a skilled warrior. In the whispered narratives of the court, he was the correct choice for Razia, the man who should have stood by her side. But Razia had looked past him, her gaze settling instead on the dark, silent strength of Yaqut. For a man like Altunia, whose pride was as brittle as it was vast, this rejection was a wound that refused to heal. The conspirators, led by the wily Itigan, played upon Altunia's insecurities like master musicians. They sent emissaries to Bathinda bearing letters dripping with calculated venom. They did not speak of politics, they spoke of manhood. They painted a picture of a queen who had lost her mind, bewitched by a slave who mocked the nobility. While you guard the frontiers, they whispered into Altunia's ear. The African sleeps in the palace, he wears the robes that should be yours. He whispers orders that the queen obeys without question. The world laughs at us, Altunia, but mostly it laughs at you. Jealousy is a powerful accelerant. It took the simmering resentment in Altunia's heart and ignited it into a blazing inferno. He convinced himself that he was not rebelling against his lawful sovereign, but liberating her from the clutches of a dark sorcerer. He convinced himself that by destroying Yaqut he could save Razia and claim his rightful place as the protector of the realm. It was a delusion, but it was enough to justify treason. In the spring of 1240, Altunia raised the banner of revolt. He seized the imperial convoys, imprisoned the royal messengers, and openly challenged the authority of Delhi. When the news reached the Red Palace, it struck Razia with the force of a physical blow. A rebellion in the distant provinces was common, but a rebellion led by Altunia, her friend, her allies personal. It was a clear signal that the rot had spread to the very limbs of the empire. She summoned her war council, her face set in a mask of grim determination. The generals advised caution, urging her to send a subordinate to deal with the uprising. But Razia knew better. She understood that this was not a military skirmish, it was a challenge to her legitimacy. If she hid behind the walls of Delhi while her oldest friend defied her, she would look weak, and a weak sultan is a dead sultan. "I will go," she declared, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "I will look him in the eye and remind him of his oaths." Yaqut stood by her side, silent as always, but his mind was racing. He saw the trap clearly. The rebellion in Bathinda was too convenient, too perfectly timed. He knew that by marching out of the capital, they were leaving the safety of their stronghold and entering a landscape where treachery could hide behind every dune. He looked at the map, spread out on the table, measuring the distance to Bathinda. It was a long march through hostile territory. He knew, with a fatalistic clarity, that he was the true target of this war. The arrows that would fly in Bathinda were meant for his heart, yet he did not dissuade her. He knew Razia better than anyone. He knew that her spirit could not tolerate cowardice. If she was to fall, she would fall charging forward, not hiding in the dark. That night, as he prepared the royal stables for the campaign, Yaqut spent a long time with Razia's war horse. He checked every strap, every buckle, sharpening his own scimitar until it could split a hair. It was the preparation of a man who does not expect to return. The departure from Delhi was a somber affair. The army that marched out of the city gates was grand, a river of steel and silk flowing under the hot sun. But the mood was heavy. The common people lined the streets throwing flowers, but their cheers were tinged with anxiety. They watched their red queen ride past, her head held high, and behind her, the towering figure of the black general, scanning the crowds with vigilant eyes. It felt less like a military expedition and more like a funeral procession for an era. As the golden domes of Delhi faded into the dust behind them, Yaqut rode up beside Razia. The protocol of the court had been left behind at the gates. Out here, on the open road, they were just two soldiers facing the storm. "The road to Bathinda is paved with old friends who have forgotten their names," Yaqut said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we shall remind them," Razia replied, though her hand tightened imperceptibly on the reins. "And if they will not remember, then let them learn the name of their doom." They rode on, into the blinding heat of the plains. Every mile took them further from the sanctuary of the capital and deeper into the web of the conspirators. The 40 in Delhi smiled as they watched the dust cloud settle. The queen had taken the bait. The lioness had left her den, and waiting for her in the fortress of Bathinda was not just a rebel army, with a culmination of a racial and political hatred that had been festering for years, ready to burst like an abscess. The board was set for the final checkmate, and the pieces were moving exactly as the traitors had planned. Part 13. Marching into the storm. The journey from Delhi to Bathinda is not merely a traverse across physical distance. It is a pilgrimage through a landscape that seems designed to test the limits of human endurance. As Razia's army snaked its way northwest, the Indian summer unleashed its full fury. The sun was a white-hot tyrant in the sky, bleaching the color from the earth and turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. Dust, fine and choking, coated everything: the armor of the soldiers, the silk of the royal banners, and the dark skin of the general who rode tirelessly at the vanguard. But the oppressive heat outside was nothing compared to the chill that was settling in the hearts of the command. For Yaqut, this march felt different from the hundreds he had undertaken before. In the past, he rode to conquer, to expand the boundaries of the empire. Now he rode to defend a dream that was already fraying at the edges. He could feel the eyes of the soldiers on him, not the Abyssinian guards who would die for him, but the Turkic mercenaries who made up the bulk of the force. Their loyalty was a fragile thing, held together by coin and fear. both of which were dwindling as they marched toward a fellow Turk, Malik al-Tunya. Yaqut knew the whispers had followed them out of the capital. He knew that in the campfires at night, the men spoke of the black general who had led their queen astray. He was walking into a den of lions, leading a pack of wolves, with only a lioness by his side. Yet, amidst this atmosphere of paranoia and impending violence, there was a strange, heartbreaking beauty in the bond between Razia and Yaqut. Stripped of the formalities of the court, away from the prying eyes of the harem eunuchs and the ministers, they found a kind of freedom in the hardships of the campaign. The road reduced everyone to their essence. Here, a queen had to drink the same tepid water as her soldiers. A general had to sleep on the same hard ground. One night, as the army camped near an oasis, the silence of the desert wrapped around them like a shroud. The sky was a vast canvas of indigo pierced by stars that looked cold and indifferent. Razia sat by a small fire, the flames illuminating the fatigue etched into her face. She was no longer the imperious monarch on the peacock throne. She was a woman carrying the weight of a dynasty on her shoulders. Yaqut stood a few paces away, his silhouette merging with the darkness, his hand resting habitually on his sword. "Do you remember the first time you put me on a horse?" Razia asked, her voice soft, breaking the stillness. She didn't look at him but stared into the fire. "I remember, Majesty," Yaqut replied, his voice deep and steady. "You were afraid, but you refused to tremble." "I am afraid now, Yaqut," she confessed, a rare admission of vulnerability that she would offer to no other soul. Not of Al-Tunya, not of death, but of being forgotten, of being written down as a mistake. Yaqut moved closer, stepping into the circle of light. He looked at her with a fierce, protective intensity. "History is written by men who talk," he said, "but it is made by those who act. You are the first, the only. Even if the sands swallow us tomorrow, the wind will carry your name forever. You are the storm, Razia, and storms are never forgotten." It was the closest he had ever come to a declaration of love. In that moment, the racial divide, the class difference, the protocols of the Sultanate, all of it, evaporated. They were just two warriors facing the end of their world together. There were no touches, no embraces. Their discipline was too ingrained for that. But the spiritual communion was absolute. They shared a knowing look, an acknowledgement that this might be their last quiet moment on earth. They knew, without saying it, that the odds were impossible. They knew that Al-Tunya had likely gathered the support of other treacherous nobles. But they also knew that they would not turn back. To retreat was to accept the cage, to advance was to choose how they would die. The next morning the horizon turned dark. It was not a storm of rain, but a storm of men. The fortress of Batinda loomed in the distance, its massive walls rising from the desert floor like the teeth of a giant beast. Arrayed before it was the rebel army of Malik al-Tunya, fresh, well-fed and confident. As Razia's weary forces drew up their battle lines, the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and anticipation. Yaqut rode to the front, checking the formation of his cavalry. He could see the hesitation in his own ranks. He could see the way his Turkic officers glanced across the field at their kinsmen in Al-Tunya's army. The betrayal was palpable. It hung in the air like the static before a lightning strike. He tightened his grip on his reins. He looked back one last time at Razia, who sat atop her war elephant, armored and resplendent, a beacon of red and gold in a sea of dust. He offered her a final salute, not the salute of a subordinate, but the salute of a guardian angel preparing to break its wings. The drums of war began to beat, a slow, rhythmic pounding that mimicked the heartbeat of the doomed. The wind picked up, whipping the banners and stinging the eyes with sand. The march was over. The talking was done. The storm they had walked into was about to break, and Yaqut knew, with the chilling clarity of a martyr, that he would be the lightning rod destined to take the first strike. Part 14. Blood on the golden sand. The moment the first arrow hissed through the scorching air of Batinda, the illusion of a fair fight shattered instantly. It was not a battle, it was an execution disguised as a war. As the two armies collided in a chaotic swirl of dust and steel, the sun seemed to glare down with an unblinking, cruel intensity, turning the battlefield into a crucible of golden blood. The sound was deafening, the screams of dying men, the terrified whinnying of horses, and the sickening crunch of iron biting into bone. But for Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, amidst this cacophony, there was a singular, terrifying clarity. He rode at the vanguard, his scimitar flashing like a crescent moon, cutting a swath through the rebel ranks. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as if his sheer will could turn the tide. He fought with the ferocity of a man possessed, the ancient warrior spirit of Abyssinia surging through his veins. He was a whirlwind of black steel, striking with a precision that terrified those who dared to cross his path. But as he pushed forward, expecting the thunder of Razia's cavalry to follow him, he heard nothing. He glanced back, and his heart turned to ice. The Turkic mercenaries of the royal army, the men he had commanded, the men he had fed and paid, had halted. They sat atop their horses, statues of betrayal, watching with impassive eyes as their general rode alone into the enemy encirclement. It was the conspiracy of the 40 revealed in its naked ugliness. They had not marched to Batinda to fight for Razia. They had marched to deliver her protector to the butcher's traitors. Razia's scream tore from her throat as she watched from her war elephant. She saw the gap open up, saw the ocean of rebel soldiers swallow the lone island that was Yaqut. She tried to order her personal guards forward, but the confusion was absolute. The chaos was orchestrated. Yaqut realized in that split second that he was a dead man walking. There was no escape, no retreat. But instead of fear, a cold, hard resolve settled over him. If this was to be his end, he would make it a death worthy of a legend. He would not die running. He would die carving a monument of corpses to his loyalty. He roared a challenge that rose above the din of battle, spurring his horse directly into the heart of Altunia's elite guard. They swarmed him like jackals attacking a lion. Spears thrust from every angle, swords slashed at his legs. Yaqut parried, struck, and killed. He fought not for his life, but for time. Every second he held them here was a second Razia might use to escape. He saw Malik Altunia in the distance, safe behind his wall of shields, watching with a mixture of triumph and grudging awe. The Black Pearl was shining brightest in his final moment. But flesh and blood, no matter how brave, cannot withstand a tide of steel. A spear hamstrung his horse, sending the magnificent beast crashing to the sand. Yaqut rolled, springing to his feet, dust and blood coating his armor. He stood alone, surrounded by a ring of enemies who hesitated, fearful of the demon in their midst. Take him, the order came. Cut him down. They rushed him all at once. Yaqut fought with the hilt of his broken sword, with his fists, with his very teeth, but the blows came too fast. A blade sliced across his chest, another pierced his side. He staggered, his vision blurring, the world tilting on its axis. He fell to his knees, his blood pouring out to quench the thirst of the dry Indian earth. From her vantage point, Razia witnessed the fall of her world. A cry of pure, unadulterated agony ripped from her soul, a sound so raw it pierced the hearts of even the traitorous soldiers. She saw the dark figure, the anchor of her life, crumple into the dust. Yaqut, gasping for air, his lungs filling with blood, looked up one last time. Through the forest of legs and the haze of pain, he sought her out. He found her silhouette against the blinding sun. He could not speak. He could not tell her that he loved her, that he had no regrets. But in his fading eyes, there was no fear. There was only a quiet resignation. I have held the wall, his spirit seemed to whisper. Now you must survive the storm alone. The final blow was delivered without mercy. The rebels descended, hacking at the fallen general in a frenzy of racial hatred and jealousy. They wanted to erase him, to desecrate the symbol of their insecurity. When the dust settled, the black general lay still. The man who had crossed an ocean, who had risen from chains to touch the sky, was gone. The battlefield fell into a strange, stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in reverence. Razia sat frozen on her elephant, her face a mask of tragedy. The fire in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a void as deep as the night. She did not resist when Altunia's men surrounded her. She did not draw her dagger. The fight had left her body the moment Yaqut's heart stopped beating. She was a queen captured, a ruler deposed, but in that moment, she was simply a woman who had lost the other half of her soul. The sun began to set, painting the sands of Bathinda in hues of violent orange and purple. The body of Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut lay on the golden sand, abandoned by the empire he had served, but embraced by the earth. His blood sank into the soil of India, a permanent testament that a son of Africa had lived, loved, and died here with an honor that his noble murderers would never possess. The lion was dead. Now, the hyenas would come for the lioness. Part 15. Legacy of the Outsider. The desert is a cruel keeper of secrets. It witnesses the fall of empires and the breaking of hearts with the same indifferent silence, burying both kings and slaves under layers of shifting sand. When the sun rose over Bathinda the morning after the slaughter, it illuminated a world that had been irrevocably grayed. Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut was gone. His body returned to the earth, and with him died the fire that had fueled the brief, luminous age of Razia Sultan. The queen survived the battle, but she did not survive the loss. She was taken prisoner by Malik Altunia, the friend who had become her jailer, the man whose jealousy had burned down a kingdom. But when Altunia looked into the eyes of the woman he had conquered, he found no victory there. He found only a hollow, haunted void. The Razia, who had commanded armies, who had ridden like the wind, had died on the battlefield alongside her Abyssinian general. In a final, desperate twist of political irony, Razia agreed to marry Altunia. It was not an act of love, nor was it a surrender. It was the cold calculation of a strategist trying to reclaim her throne, a last-ditch effort to unite their fractured forces against the usurpers in Delhi. But the soul of the resistance was broken. Without Yaqut, the iron shield, the silent tactician, the moral compass, the magic was gone. Their subsequent march back to Delhi to reclaim the crown was a march of ghosts. They were defeated, not by the strength of their enemies, but by the weight of their own tragedy. In October 1240, barely months after Yaqut's death, Razia and Altunia were killed, reportedly by simple bandits while fleeing a lost battle. The first and only female sultan of Delhi, the woman who had dared to wear the robes of a king, ended her life in the dust of a lonely forest, far from the marble halls of her birth. But as the centuries rolled on, grinding the stones of the Red Palace into dust, a strange phenomenon occurred. The history books, written by the court chroniclers of the succeeding dynasties, tried to bury the name of Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut. They tried to reduce him to a footnote, a scandalous whisper, a black slave who had corrupted a queen. They weaponized his race to delegitimize Razia's reign, using his proximity to her as proof of her moral failing. To the patriarchal historians, a woman ruling was bad enough. A woman ruling with a black man at her right hand was an abomination that had to be erased or distorted. Yet, truth has a way of surviving in the margins. The legacy of Yaqut is not found in the grand monuments of Delhi. There is no tomb for him, no mausoleum where pilgrims light incense. His legacy is found in the unwritten, subversive history of the outsider. He stands as the prologue to a magnificent, often overlooked chapter of black history in India. He was the forerunner of the cities who would come after him, men like Malik Amba, the Ethiopian slave who became a kingmaker in the Deccan, defeating the mighty Mughals time and again. Yaqut proved, centuries before the modern era, that the spirit of the African diaspora was not defined by chains, but by an unquenchable capacity for greatness. Yaqut's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of the racial fear that still permeates the corridors of power today. He was destroyed not because he was incompetent, but because he was too competent. He was killed because he defied the assigned narrative of his skin color. He dared to be intellectual, he dared to be noble, and he dared to love a woman who was above his station. His life asks us a haunting question. How many empires have fallen? How many golden ages have been lost simply because the world was too afraid to embrace the talent of the other? In the end, the story of the slave and the queen is not a tragedy of defeat, it is a triumph of connection. In a world that was obsessed with bloodlines, castes, and purity, two lonely souls found a home in each other. Razia saw the king in the slave, and Yaqut saw the woman in the sultan. Their bond defied the rigid geometry of their time. It was a love whether platonic or romantic. It matters not that was purer than the gold of the treasury, for it was bought with the currency of blood and loyalty. Today, if you walk through the winding lanes of Old Delhi, past the ruins of Maroli, you might hear the wind whispering through the kika trees. It is a dry, mournful sound, but if you listen closely, with the heart rather than the ear, you might hear the faint echo of hoofbeats. You might sense the presence of a shadow that stands tall and unbroken. It is the spirit of Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, the enslaved lover, the black general, forever standing guard over the memory of his queen. He remains the eternal outsider, reminding us that sometimes the most essential pillar of the temple is the one carved from the darkest stone, hidden in the deepest shadow, holding up the roof long after the gilded statues have crumbled. The history of the world is often a history of exclusion, but the story of Yaqut is a beacon. It tells us that dignity is not given, it is innate. It tells us that loyalty is the highest form of nobility. And it tells us that even if they erase your name from the books, they cannot erase the footprints you left on the sands of time. The river of time flows on, washing away the lies, until only the truth remains, shining like a black pearl in the palm of history. Music swells, melancholic but inspiring, slowly fading out, and so, the curtain falls on the saga of the Red Queen and her black general. It is a story that began in the mountains of Ethiopia and ended in the dust of India, a journey that spanned oceans and defied the rigid laws of men. We leave them now, not in the darkness of the grave, but in the light of our remembrance, for as long as we tell their story, they live. As long as we acknowledge the courage of the marginalized, their sacrifice was not in vain.